Section 20 of the Expression of the Emotions in Man and Animals. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Expression of the Emotions in Man and Animals by Charles Darwin. Chapter 11. Disdain, Contempt, Disgust, Guilt, Pride, etc. Helplessness, Patience, Affirmation, and Negation. Continued. Part 2. Helplessness, Impotence, Shrugging the Shoulders. When a man wishes to show that he cannot do something, or prevent something being done, he often raises, with a quick movement, both shoulders. At the same time, if the whole gesture is completed, he bends his elbows closely inwards, raising his open hands, turning them outwards, with the fingers separated. The head is often thrown a little on one side. The eyebrows are elevated, and this causes wrinkles across the forehead. The mouth is generally opened. I may mention, in order to show how unconsciously the features are thus acted on, that though I had often intentionally shrugged my shoulders to observe how my arms were placed, I was not at all aware that my eyebrows were raised and mouth opened, until I looked at myself in a glass. And since then I have noticed the same movements in the faces of others. In the accompanying Plate 6, Figures 3 and 4, Mr. Raylander has successfully acted the gesture of shrugging the shoulders. Englishmen are much less demonstrative than the men of most other European nations, and they shrug their shoulders far less frequently and energetically than Frenchmen or Italians do. The gesture varies in all degrees from the complex movement just described to only a momentary and scarcely perceptible raising of both shoulders, or, as I have noticed in a lady sitting in an armchair, to the mere turning slightly outwards of the open hands with separated fingers. I have never seen very young English children shrug their shoulders, but the following case was observed with care by a medical professor and excellent observer, and has been communicated to me by him. The father of this gentleman was a Parisian, and his mother a Scotch lady. His wife is of British extraction on both sides, and my informant does not believe that she ever shrugged her shoulders in her life. His children have been reared in England, and the nursemaid is a thorough Englishwoman who has never been seen to shrug her shoulders. Now his eldest daughter was observed to shrug her shoulders at the age of between 16 and 18 months, her mother exclaiming at the time, "Look at the little French girl shrugging her shoulders." At first she often acted thus, sometimes throwing her head a little backwards and on one side, but she did not, as far as was observed, move her elbows and hands in the usual manner. The habit gradually wore away, and now, when she is a little over 4 years old, she is never seen to act thus. The father is told that he sometimes shrugs his shoulders, especially when arguing with anyone, but it is extremely improbable that his daughter should have imitated him at so early an age, for, as he remarks, she could not possibly have often seen this gesture in him. Moreover, if the habit had been acquired through imitation, it is not probable that it would so soon have been spontaneously discontinued by this child, and, as we shall immediately see by a second child, though the father still lived with his family. This little girl, it may be added, resembles her Parisian grandfather in countenance to an almost absurd degree. She also presents another and very curious resemblance to him, namely, by practicing a singular trick. When she impatiently wants something, she holds out her little hand and rapidly rubs the thumb against the index and middle finger. Now this same trick was frequently performed under the same circumstances by her grandfather. This gentleman's second daughter also shrugged her shoulders before the age of 18 months, and afterward discontinued the habit. It is, of course, possible that she may have imitated her elder sister, but she continued it after her sister had lost the habit. She at first resembled her Parisian grandfather in a less degree than did her sister at the same age, but now in a greater degree, She likewise practices to the present time the peculiar habit of rubbing together, when impatient, her thumb and two of her forefingers. In this latter case we have a good instance, like those given in a former chapter, of the inheritance of a trick or gesture, for no one, I presume, will attribute to mere coincidence so peculiar a habit as this, which was common to the grandfather and his two grandchildren, who had never seen him. Considering all the circumstances with reference to these children shrugging their shoulders, it can hardly be doubted that they have inherited the habit from their French progenitors, although they have only 1/4 French blood in their veins, and although their grandfather did not often shrug his shoulders. There is nothing very unusual, though the fact is interesting, in these children having gained by inheritance a habit during early youth and then discontinuing it, for it is of frequent occurrence with many kinds of animals that certain characters are retained for a period by the young and are then lost. As it appeared to me at one time improbable in a high degree that so complex a gesture as shrugging the shoulders together with the accompanying movements should be innate, I was anxious to ascertain whether the blind and deaf Laura Bridgman, who could not have learnt the habit by imitation, practiced it, and I have heard, through Dr. Innes, from a lady who has lately had charge of her, that she does shrug her shoulders, turn in her elbows, and raise her eyebrows in the same manner as other people, and under the same circumstances. I was also anxious to learn whether this gesture was practiced by the various races of man, especially by those who never had much intercourse with Europeans. We shall see that they act in this manner, but it appears that the gesture is sometimes confined to merely raising or shrugging the shoulders without the other movements. Mr. Scott has frequently seen this gesture in the Bengalese and Dangars, the latter constituting a distinct race, who are employed in the Botanic Garden at Calcutta, when, for instance, they have declared that they could not do some work, such as lifting a heavy weight. He ordered a Bengali to climb a lofty tree, but the man, with a shrug of his shoulders and a lateral shake of his head, said he could not. Mr. Scott, knowing that the man was lazy, thought he could, and insisted on his trying. His face now became pale, his arms dropped to his sides, his mouth and eyes were widely opened, and again surveying the tree, he looked askant at Mr. Scott, shrugged his shoulders, inverted his elbows, extended his open hands, and with a few quick lateral shakes of the head, declared his inability. Mr. H. Erskine has likewise seen the natives of India shrugging their shoulders, but he has never seen the elbows turned so much inwards as with us, and whilst shrugging their shoulders they sometimes lay their uncrossed hands on their breasts. With the wild Malays of the interior of Malacca, and with the Bugis, true Malays, though speaking a different language, Mr. Geach has often seen this gesture. I presume that it is complete, as, in answer to my query descriptive of the movements of the shoulders, arms, hands, and face, Mr. Geach remarks, "It is performed in a beautiful style." I have lost an extract from a scientific voyage, in which shrugging the shoulders by some natives, Micronesians, of the Caroline Archipelago in the Pacific Ocean was well described. Captain Speedy informs me that the Abyssinians shrug their shoulders, but enters into no details. Mr. Asa Gray saw an Arab dragoman in Alexandria acting exactly as described in my query, when an old gentleman on whom he attended would not go in the proper direction which had been pointed out to him. Mr. Washington Matthews says, in reference to the wild Indian tribes of the western parts of the United States, "I have on a few occasions detected men using a slight apologetic shrug, but the rest of the demonstration which you described I have not witnessed." Fritz Müller informs me that he has seen the negroes in Brazil shrugging their shoulders, but it is of course possible that they may have learnt to do so by imitating the Portuguese. Mrs. Barber has never seen this gesture with the Kaffirs of South Africa, and Geika, judging from his answer, did not even understand what was meant by my description. Mr. Swinhoe is also doubtful about the Chinese, but he has seen them, under the circumstances which would make us shrug our shoulders, press their right elbow against their side, raise their eyebrows, lift up their hand with the palm directed toward the person addressed, and shake it from right to left. Lastly, with respect to the Australians, 4 of my informants answer by a simple negative and 1 by a simple affirmative. Mr. Bunnet, who has had excellent opportunities for observation on the borders of the colony of Victory, also answers by a yes, adding that the gesture is performed in a more subdued and less demonstrative manner than is the case with civilized nations. This circumstance may account for its not having been noticed by 4 of my informants. These statements relating to Europeans, Hindus, the hill tribes of India, Malays, Micronesians, Abyssinians, Arabs, Negroes, Indians of North America, and apparently to the Australians, many of these natives having had scarcely any intercourse with Europeans, are sufficient to show that shrugging the shoulders, accompanied in some cases by other proper movements, is a gesture natural to mankind. This gesture implies an unintentional or unavoidable action on our part, or one that we cannot perform, or an action performed by another person which we cannot prevent. It accompanies such speeches as, "It was not my fault," "It is impossible for me to grant this favor," "He must follow his own course, I cannot stop him." Shrugging the shoulders likewise expresses patience or the absence of any intention to resist. Hence the muscles which raise the shoulders are sometimes called, as I have been informed by an artist, the patience muscles. Shylock the Jew says, "Signor Antonio, many a time and oft, in the Rialto you have rated me. About my moneys and usances, still I have borne it with a patient shrug." Merchant of Venice, Act 1, Scene 3. Sir Charles Bell has given a lifelike figure of a man who is shrinking back from some terrible danger and is on the point of screaming out in abject terror. He is represented with his shoulders lifted up almost to his ears, and this at once declares that there is no thought of resistance. A shrugging the shoulders generally implies, "I cannot do this or that." So, by a slight chance, it sometimes implies, "I won't do it." The movement then expresses a dogged determination not to act. Olmsted describes an Indian in Texas as giving a great shrug to his shoulders when he was informed that a party of men were Germans and not Americans, thus expressing that he would have nothing to do with them. Sulky and obstinate children may be seen with both their shoulders raised high up, but this movement is not associated with the others which generally accompany a true shrug. An excellent observer, in describing a young man who was determined not to yield to his father's desire, says, "He thrust his hands deep down into his pockets, and set up his shoulders to his ears, which was a good warning that, come right or wrong, this rock should fly from its firm base as soon as Jack would, and that any remonstrance on the subject was purely futile. As soon as the son got his own way, he put his shoulders into their natural position." Resignation is sometimes shown by the open hands being placed one over the other on the lower part of the body. I should not have thought this little gesture worth even a passing notice had not Dr. William Ogle remarked to me that he had 2 or 3 times observed it in patients who were preparing for operations under chloroform. They exhibited no great fear, but seemed to declare by this posture of their hands that they had made up their minds and were resigned to the inevitable. We may now inquire why men in all parts of the world, when they feel, whether or not they wish to show this feeling, that they cannot or will not do something, or will not resist something if done by another, shrug their shoulders, at the same time often bending in their elbows, showing the palms of their hands with extended fingers, often throwing their heads a little on one side, raising their eyebrows, and opening their mouths. These states of the mind are either simply passive or show a determination not to act. None of the above movements are of the least service. The explanation lies, I cannot doubt, in the principle of unconscious antithesis. This principle here seems to come into play as clearly as in the case of a dog, who, when feeling savage, puts himself in the proper attitude for attacking and for making himself appear terrible to his enemy, but as soon as he feels affectionate, throws his whole body into a directly opposite attitude. though this is of no direct use to him. Let it be observed how an indignant man who resents and will not submit to some inquiry holds his head erect, squares his shoulders, and expands his chest. He often clenches his fist and puts one or both arms in the proper position for attack or defense, with the muscles of his limbs rigid. He frowns, that is, he contracts and lowers his brows, and being determined, closes his mouth. The actions and attitude of a helpless man are in every one of these respects exactly the reverse. In Plate 6 we may imagine one of the figures on the left side to have just said, "What do you mean by insulting me?" and one of the figures on the right to answer, "I really could not help it." The helpless man unconsciously contracts the muscles of his forehead, which are antagonistic to those that cause a frown, and thus raises his eyebrows. At the same time he relaxes the muscles about the mouth, so that the lower jaw drops. The antithesis is complete in every detail, not only in the movements of the features, but in the position of the limbs and in the attitude of the whole body, as may be seen in the accompanying plate. As the helpless or apologetic man often wishes to show his state of mind, he then acts in a conspicuous or demonstrative manner. In accordance with the fact that squaring the elbows and clenching the fists are gestures by no means universal with the men of all races when they feel indignant and are prepared to attack their enemy, so it appears that a helpless or apologetic frame of mind is expressed in many parts of the world by merely shrugging the shoulders, without turning inwards the elbows and opening the hands. The man or child who is obstinate, or one who is resigned to some great misfortune, has in neither case any idea of resistance by active means, and he expresses this state of mind by simply keeping his shoulders raised, or he may possibly fold his arms across his breast. Signs of affirmation or approval, and of negation or disapproval: nodding and shaking the head. I was curious to ascertain how far the common signs used by us in affirmation and negation were general throughout the world. These signs are indeed to a certain extent expressive of our feelings, as we give a vertical nod of approval with a smile to our children, when we approve of their conduct, and shake our heads laterally with a frown when we disapprove. With infants, the first act of denial consists in refusing food, and I repeatedly noticed with my own infants that they did so by withdrawing their heads laterally from the breast or from anything offered them in a spoon. In accepting food and in taking it into their mouths, they incline their heads forwards. Since making these observations, I have been informed that the same idea had occurred to Charma. It deserves notice that in accepting or taking food, there is only a single movement forward, and a single nod implies an affirmation. On the other hand, in refusing food, especially if it be pressed on them, children frequently move their heads several times from side to side, as we do in shaking our heads in negation. Moreover, in the case of refusal, the head is not rarely thrown backwards, or the mouth is closed, so that these movements might likewise come to serve as signs of negation. Mr. Wedgwood remarks on this subject that when the voice is exerted with closed teeth or lips, it produces the sound of the letter N or M. Hence we may account for the use of the particle ne to signify negation, and possibly also of the Greek m in the same sense. That these signs are innate or instinctive, at least with Anglo-Saxons, is rendered highly probable by the blind and deaf Laura Bridgman, constantly accompanying her yes with the common affirmative nod, and her no with our negative shake of the head. Had not Mr. Lieber stated to the contrary, I should have imagined that these gestures might have been acquired or learnt by her, considering her wonderful sense of touch and appreciation of the movements of others. With microcephalous idiots who are so degraded that they never learn to speak, one of them is described by Vogt as answering, when asked whether he wished for more food or drink, by inclining or shaking his head. Schmaltz, in his remarkable dissertation on the education of the deaf and dumb, as well as of children raised only 1 degree above idiocy, assumes that they can always both make and understand the common signs of affirmation and negation. Nevertheless, if we look to the various races of man, these signs are not so universally employed as I should have expected. Yet they seem too general to be ranked as altogether conventional or artificial. My informants assert that both signs are used by the Malays, by the natives of Ceylon, the Chinese, the Negroes of the Guinea coast, and, according to Geika, by the Kafirs of South Africa, though with these latter people Mrs. Barber has never seen a lateral shake used as a negative. With respect to the Australians, 7 observers agree that a nod is given in affirmation. 5 agree about a lateral shake in negation, accompanied or not by some word. But Mr. Dyson Lacey has never seen this latter sign in Queensland, and Mr. Bulmer says that in Gippsland a negative is expressed by throwing the head a little backwards and putting out the tongue. At the northern extremity of the continent, near Torres Straits, the natives, when uttering a negative, don't shake the head with it, but holding up the right hand, shake it by turning it half round and back again 2 or 3 times. The throwing back of the head with a cluck of the tongue is said to be used as a negative by the modern Greeks and Turks, the latter people expressing yes by a movement like that made by us when we shake our heads. The Abyssinians, as I am informed by Captain Speedy, express a negative by jerking the head to the right shoulder, together with a slight cluck, the mouth being closed. An affirmation is expressed by the head being thrown backwards and the eyebrows raised for an instant. The Tagals of Luzon in the Philippine archipelago, as I hear from Dr. Adolf Meyer, when they say yes, also throw the head backwards. According to the Raja Brook, the Dayaks of Borneo express an affirmation by raising the eyebrows, and a negation by slightly contracting them, together with a peculiar look from the eyes. With the Arabs on the Nile, Professor and Mrs. Asa Gray concluded that nodding in affirmation was rare, whilst shaking the head in negation was never used, and was not even understood by them. With the Eskimo, a nod means yes, and a wink no. The New Zealanders elevate the head and chin in place of nodding acquiescence. With the Hindus, Mr. H. Erskine concludes, from inquiries made from experienced Europeans and from native gentlemen, that the signs of affirmation and negation vary, a nod and a lateral shake being sometimes used as we do, but a negative is more commonly expressed by the head being thrown suddenly backwards and a little to one side with a cluck of the tongue. What the meaning may be of this cluck of the tongue, which has been observed with various people, I cannot imagine. A native gentleman stated that affirmation is frequently shown by the head being thrown to the left. I asked Mr. Scott to attend particularly to this point, and after repeated observations, he believes that a vertical nod is not commonly used by the natives in affirmation, but that the head is first thrown backwards, either to the left or to the right, and then jerked obliquely forwards only once. This movement would perhaps have been described by a less careful observer as a lateral shake. He also states that in negation the head is usually held nearly upright and shaken several times. Mr. Bridges informs me that the Fuegians nod their heads vertically in affirmation and shake them laterally in denial. With the wild Indians of North America, according to Mr. Washington Matthews, nodding and shaking the head have been learnt from Europeans and are not naturally employed. They express affirmation by describing with the hand, all the fingers except the index being flexed a curve downwards and outwards from the body, whilst negation is expressed by moving the open hand outwards with the palm facing inwards. Other observers state that the sign of affirmation with these Indians is the forefinger being raised and then lowered and pointed to the ground, or the hand is waved straight forward from the face, and that the sign of negation is the finger or whole hand shaken from side to side. This latter movement probably represents in all cases the lateral shaking of the head. The Italians are said in like manner to move the lifted finger from right to left in negation, as indeed we English sometimes do. On the whole, we find considerable diversity in the signs of affirmation and negation in the different races of man. With respect to negation, if we admit that the shaking of the finger or hand from side to side is symbolic of the lateral movement of the head, and if we admit that the sudden backward movement of the head represents one of the actions often practiced by young children in refusing food, then there is much uniformity throughout the world in the signs of negation, and we can see how they originated. The most marked exceptions are presented by the Arabs, Eskimo, some Australian tribes, and Dayaks. With the latter, a frown is the sign of negation, and with us, frowning often accompanies a lateral shake of the head. With respect to nodding in affirmation, the exceptions are rather more numerous, namely with some of the Hindus, with the Turks, Abyssinians, Dayaks, Tagals, and New Zealanders. The eyebrows are sometimes raised in affirmation, as a person, in bending his head forwards and downwards, naturally looks up to the person whom he addresses, he will be apt to raise his eyebrows, and this sign may thus have arisen as an abbreviation. So again with the New Zealanders, the lifting up of the chin and head in affirmation may perhaps represent, in an abbreviated form, the upward movement of the head after it has been nodded forwards and downwards. End of section 20.